I think maybe if I just start with talking about how your books have everything in them, that they have suspense, murder, romance and history. And I was just wondering if that was because you couldn't commit to one genre, that you just had to do it all.
Yeah, I think it probably does have something to do with that. I'll just say hello, first of all. Thank you so much for coming. Yes, when I started writing, I wrote a couple of manuscripts before The Shifting Fog, and I was new to writing, and I wrote much more easily describable books in terms of genre. You know, this is a crime book. And then both of those manuscripts were sent out to publishers everywhere, and they were all, you know, sent back with no thank yous. And they were right, that, you know, they were not good manuscripts, so thank goodness they weren't published. But when I started writing The Shifting Fog, I had a baby. He was, I think, 7 months old when I started. And as far as I could see, I had dropped so far out of the world of publishing that it was just something that wasn't going to happen for me. And I was okay with that. I had been so disappointed, you know, when each manuscript came back, but I'd had a baby and life had moved on, and I thought, well, I love writing. Of course I'm going to keep doing it, but this time I'm just going to write a book that has everything I love in it, and I don't know what sort of book that will be. And I still, you know, when people say describe your books in, you know, 3 words, I can't really do it. It's like, well, it's sort of a mystery, but it's got an historical thread, but it's not historical fiction, and there's a romance, but sometimes it doesn't work out so well, you know, so it's unhappy love. You know, and I find it very difficult to describe too, but they certainly contain all the things that I love in a book.
Now, I think with this particular reading the new book, there's a lot in there that reminds me of why we love reading and why we started reading as children. And it begins with a prologue from a book by Raymond Blythe called The True History of the Mudman. And I read it, and it was so convincing that I thought, who's Raymond Blythe? Why don't I know him? So I went and Googled to find out who he was, and came back to Kate Morton. And of course, he was just a figment of Kate's imagination. But there's a lot of references to nursery rhymes, to reading. The characters in the book, when they look back at their childhood, it was falling in love with reading. What was your experience, and why do you bring that into your novels?
Well, first of all, I'm so pleased to hear you describe the books that way, because that's what I'm all about. I'm a pathological reader, always have been. I think I learnt to read when I was about 4. My parents were both readers, and I was the first of their children, so every, you know, object in our house had a sticker on it that said, you know, table, door, high chair, in the hopes that I would somehow absorb this and learn to read. So, and I guess I did. I read very early, and I'll read cereal packets and bus tickets and whatever I can. You know, you see words, you read them. And I think I'm preaching to the choir. We're all of us like that. And for me, reading as a child, it was that feeling of opening a book and realizing that the black marks on the white pages were actually doorways. And if you knew how to open them, you could slide down the rabbit hole and into another world, and you did not need to come up for air until you turned the cover. You know, and that feeling of absolute absorption in a different world. It doesn't have to be a fantasy world, but another world, a fictional world. That's addictive. And I love to feel that when I'm reading. And I feel that a lot of books written for adults, because, you know, I'm not trying to write a childish book, but I want that feeling. I still want that as an adult. You know, why doesn't everybody? You know, I think there's this feeling that when you get older, you should read for other reasons, and that there should be other pleasures that you get from books. And, you know, I believe we can learn from what we read, but what's wrong with story? You know, when did story become an unfashionable thing in a book? I don't know.
And I'll just bring up now that you're reading to your son's class. You're reading The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And what sort of reaction are you getting from the children?
It's actually the most fulfilling thing I do at the moment. I started last year when my little boy started prep. and I read The Enchanted Wood by Enid Blyton. And this year he's in grade 1 and he's in a year 1-2 class, and we just finished The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And these are kids who, a lot of them, you know, they're little, and it's their first chapter book experience, where they're going from having pictures and it's all sort of laid out for them to actually having to take that leap and use their imagination to bring the world to life. And it is such a joy and a privilege to be the one who gets to introduce them to the idea of the door in the back of the wardrobe. You know, the fact that one day you might find a wardrobe, and you'll go in and the coats will rub your shoulders, and they will, you know, as you walk further, they'll turn to fir trees and the air will get cold, and you'll realise you've gone to a completely other, you know, a different place. To be the one to bring that into their world is, you know, I feel very privileged.
And in many ways in your new book, you take readers on a similar journey into a castle where quite an adventure unfolds. But this wasn't really meant to be your third book, was it?
It was not, no. I've in the past, when I talk about writing, I suspect I might have come across as really smug. Looking back, I used to say, oh, you know, I plot and plan, I know exactly where I'm going, that's a big part of it for me. And then by the time I sit down to write, I just know what I'm doing. So, you know, with this in mind, I had my second son, Louis, around the same time as The Forgotten Garden was published. And I thought, well, you know, I'm a new mother again. What better thing to do than start book 3? Which seems like utter madness, but seemed like a good idea at the time. So I did. I had a synopsis, and I thought, well, this is a good story. I like the characters and the setting. This will work. And we went to England, and I did lots of research. You know, I got to climb down into an abandoned underground tube station, and did a tour of blitz-torn London, and went out to Kent and climbed Sissinghurst Castle Tower, all these wonderful things. And then I came back and started to write. And I kept writing, and it didn't feel as I like writing to feel. You know, I could tell the story was progressing, but it felt perfunctory, I suppose. And I thought, well, this is this book's journey. Maybe this is just how it's going to feel. I'm a professional. I have a contract that I have to fulfill. Just keep writing. You know, the world of the story will pull me along soon. Meanwhile, these other ladies had set up in my head and started telling me, you know, write about us, write about us. They lived in a deep, dark castle, in a big old crumbly castle out in Kent. 3 sisters who'd lived there since they were born and had been raised by their father, Raymond Blythe, who'd written this sort of gothic classic children's story in 1918, the sort that, like, a bit like Peter Pan, that gets under a culture's skin, and everybody's read it or seen the play that's in the West End, and everybody knows the story. So these ladies, the sisters, were old ladies now, and they had a deep, dark secret. And they kept talking to me, telling me, write this story. I said, I can't, I'm in the middle of something. I've written 60,000 words, which, you know, my books are pretty long, so I was about a third of the way through. And then I couldn't get it out of my head. I thought I'd save it for book 4, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And after much soul searching, I decided, all right, I'll give it a week. I'll set the other project aside temporarily, and I'll give voice to these annoying, loud, bossy sisters. And I sat down one night and I started the story at the beginning, and by the time I went to bed that night, I just knew I wasn't going back to the original story, because it felt the way writing should feel, as if I was writing down, as if I'd been charged with writing down real events that had happened to real people. And the thrill of that, I mean, that's what keeps me coming back even when I wasn't published. It's that feeling of immersion in the world of the story. And I had it with this book. I think the first chapter of the story now is what I wrote that night, and it was right.
And there's many layers. It's quite a complex story, a lot of characters. It's a lot of it's told from the viewpoint of Edith, who works in book publishing, and she's discovered that her mother was an evacuee during World War II, and has actually gone to the castle to live for about a year.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, how did her character develop?
Yeah, Edie, my books usually have a contemporary storyline, or 1992 in this case, and an historical storyline, and the two sort of weave together so that by the end we see how they relate. And that was the case with this book too. I love the past, but I like it insofar as it's tethered to the present. That's what fascinates me, that the way the past, comes back to haunt us in our present lives, and it's never really left, to lie. So Edie is my contemporary narrator, and she was actually a joy to write. I suspect she's the most autobiographical of any of the Viewpoint characters I've written, and her voice came very easily. She's, a little old-fashioned, I guess. She funnily enough, like me, loved reading as a child, and she becomes a little romantic, I guess, her ideas about the world. So she becomes embroiled in the lives of these sisters quite easily, which was very convenient for me.
And there's another thread, yet another layer to it. There's at the back of the book, there's a lot of acknowledgements of research you did and books you've read, but there was one in particular that you read, and I'm trying to remember the name, where she talked about all the women who...
Singled out?
Yes, singled out. Yeah.
I read this book because, I should explain, when I say that the sisters started talking to me, it sounds like, this magically a plot appeared, and it's never like that. In retrospect, you can always look back and trace where these threads first started weaving together. And one of the places was years ago, before I started even the now defunct Book 3. I had read this book by Virginia Nicholson called Singled Out, and the subtitle was something to the effect of, the 2 million women left over in England after World War I, when, so many of the young men they were supposed to marry were killed. And it's a wonderful book. It's fascinating. Virginia Nicholson has used a lot of real-life diaries and letters and pieces of fact like that to illustrate her thesis. And what I found interesting about it was that these were women who had been raised with no other expectation about their life and how they would fill it, other than, you don't need to learn this, this, and this, because you will grow up and then you will marry a wealthy man, and that will be your life. And then that didn't happen. And these are the spinster aunts who turn up throughout fiction, set in the earlier 20th century. And I was fascinated, and I wanted to give voice to some of these women and get beneath the skin of women for whom life changed so dramatically. And
your observation of the sisters, especially when they're elderly, I just wondered, your writing is incredibly strong in terms of evoking the image and the gestures and how it is in your latter years. And I just wonder, where you draw that from your own family, or have you had much to do with elderly people?
Thank you for that. I'm really glad that they do come through as real people. I grew up in a place called Tamborine Mountain. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's in the hinterland of the Gold Coast, in southeast Queensland. And whenever I was a child in the 80s, but whenever I hear people talking about, sort of wistfully about their childhood in the 50s, I sort of go, yep, that's pretty much how it was on Tamborine in the 80s as well. Lots of freedom, the sort of days where a really long, sunny childhood where I can't remember adults being in it much. We'd sort of head out on our bikes and collect tadpoles and not see mum and dad until we came home, on dusk that evening with, various other neighbourhood kids who'd come with us and stay for dinner. And anyway, Tamborine Mountain is a small community. It's cooler than the Brisbane and the Gold Coast by about 5 degrees. So there's a large proportion of expat British people living up there, because it is a friendlier climate. And small community, I had friends who were decades older than I was growing up. I actually think one of the most influential in the back of the book was a man called Herbert Davies, who had been the head of drama for Welsh BBC and had moved to Tambourine with his wife Rita, who was a repertory stage actress. And they taught drama lessons, and I learnt drama from Rita when I was a little girl. And when I got older, I became very good friends with both of them, but with Herbert in particular. He was just incredible. You know, he would tell stories, and not in a show-offy, name-dropping way, but you know, he'd been friends with Dylan Thomas, and he'd been in the pub when Richard Burton came in and said, "I'm going to marry Liz, you know, what do you guys think about that?" So he had all these amazing stories, and I think he was 70 when I met him. I was 10, and we remained great friends for 2 decades until he died a few years ago at, I think, 93. He was coy. He would never divulge his true age, but he was about 93, I believe. And it was very normal for me to have friends who were much older than I was.
And there is a Herbert in the book as well.
There is, and although I changed certain aspects of his character, the essence of Herbert in the book really is my Herbert. He was a book lover. He had a house with books that went from floor to ceiling, tiny little cottage, and you went in and there were always overflowing ashtrays and dust and lots of books, and no matter what we were talking about, he would, you know, sort of lift a waxen finger and head over to the shelf and find the perfect book to illuminate the subject further. And it's so normal for me at the time, but in retrospect, such a fortunate meeting.
And what was I say? I was also, you've studied Victorian literature.
Yes.
And it did strike me, even before I knew that in your writing it does have that old-fashioned quality and depth and sort of the characters are intriguing and revealed slowly to you. And I just wondered how much your study of Victorian literature had influenced your own writing.
Yeah, I wonder, or whether I was attracted to Victorian lit because that's the kind of world I want to inhabit. I've heard it said of Dickens that his books are the sort of places, they're worlds that you can live inside as a reader, and I really like that quote, and I hope that it's like that in my books too, where there's not so much detail that you're skimming, but enough detail that the world really does sort of come to life as you start to read, and you do, as a reader, you know, inhabit it. And that's something I love in a book. I like to get to the end of a book and know all sorts of things about the character and the setting and not remember how I know them. You know, in the same way in our real lives, we don't remember where we first saw things or heard things or thought them. We just accumulate knowledge, and I want the knowledge of my fictional world to be acquired in that sort of dense, haphazard way. You know.
And the books also have a very English sensibility. And, you know, given you grew up in Queensland, you could have set the book there. And, so why are they so English, and what attracts you to making that your principal setting?
Yeah, and I don't know whether I will continue always to do that, but it just, at the moment I write what I love, and that, you know, I do enjoy invoking that sort of feeling and world and atmosphere in my stories. I think in the beginning it was, you know, a really cheap mode of travel. I got to sit down and in the sweltering heat of a Brisbane summer and transport myself to a place where snowflakes were kissing the glass and fires were crackling. And I do love old buildings. And we have beautiful old buildings in Australia too, of course, but there's something wonderful for me as a person and as a writer about a building in which people have lived for, you know, 600 and 700 years. That's what The Distant Hours are in this book. It's that sense you get when you're in a very old place where many generations have carried out their lives before you. And you get that feeling, you know, where if you just turned around quickly enough, you might catch, you know, a vague, shadowy imprint of the people who had gone before. I'm very attracted to that idea. And it's one of the things I like to try and capture in my fiction.
And with writing this book, there was a point, I think, when you were about 4/5 of the way through, where you had to leave your family behind and go into complete isolation to get the focus that you needed to tie everything together.
Yes, I did. I will forever remember Binnaburra as writing boot camp because that's what it was for me. I have 2 little boys. One is 7 and one is 2.5. And you know, like all working parents, my husband and I juggle things as best we can and hope never to drop one of the serious ones on the ground. But there does come a time, particularly toward the end of a book, where what you really want is 48, if not 72 hours of solitude, you know, just to try and nut things out. And with this book, because I'd started it in a different way to the way I'd written in the past, it's a much more inspired and organic story, but that meant I didn't have my checklist and plan to follow. So I'd got to about 80-90% of the way through, and I had all these loose ends, and I knew they would tie up. It's like a puzzle where all the pieces are the same shade, but you're not quite sure how to fit them in to make the picture that you need. So I went up to Binnaburra, which is really, really high in the mountains in southeast Queensland. And it's actually the sort of place people go bushwalking, but I did no bushwalking. I just, sort of hunkered down, and my family dropped me there and drove off. And my little boy Oliver, who has a melancholy bent, sort of looked out the back of the car, waving and holding up one of my strands of hair, going, "Mommy!" So I felt great about it. And, it was the real nadir of my writing experience with The Distant Hours in some ways, because I was getting close to deadline. And I knew I'd be able to work it out, but I had to do it in time. So I thought and scribbled and, wrote in my diary, "I am despairing," and all these sorts of things. And on, I think, the second or third day, I'd given up hope and I'd just gone to, the way you do, procrastinate and sit by the window. And I was looking outside, and it was just on dusk, and a storm started to blow up. And up in the mountains, dusk was falling and fog was sort of rolling up the hills and through the trees and up the very narrow road that leads up to the top of Binnaburra. And as I was sitting there, and the trees started to bend and gnash their teeth, and the leaves were, rattling and, like silver, pieces of silver, I just had this vision. And I'd been struggling to work out what the true history of the Mudman, my story in the story, was going to be about. And all of a sudden, I had this vision of a young girl whose bedroom or nursery was at the very top of a tower in a castle, and she climbed up onto the bookcase to look out the window as darkness was falling, on the land, and a storm was blowing in. And as she sat there, the tiny little pinpricks of light on the horizon in the village started to turn off as everybody else in the world fell asleep, except this little girl. And as she sat there, thinking about her future and wondering about what she'd do when she finally grew up and left the castle, down below her something started to happen. Down in the muddy moat that encircled the base of the castle, something had begun to breathe. And unbeknownst to the little girl, a dark figure, climbed out of the moat and started to clamber up the side of the tower. And this came so completely that I raced back to my computer, where I had previously been hitting my head against the screen, and I just started to type, and I said it out loud as I was writing. And it was right. And it's actually in the book now, at the very beginning, you do get to read this extract from the true history of the Mudman. And the most brilliant thing was, through writing the prologue, I suddenly saw what I had to do to tie up all the other loose ends for the conclusion of my story. So it was, the best of times, it was the worst of times. But I'm certainly glad I did it.
Now, there's some general questions that I'd like to ask you about, writing and your life, but this probably is a good chance to, if you wouldn't mind doing a reading from the book, if everyone's happy about that, and so that you can get a real sense of
it won't be too
writing.
Long, I promise. Rather than read you the prologue about the Mudman, which I'll let you save for yourself, I thought I could start at the very beginning, because that seems like a good place to start. Okay, now the actual story starts in 1992, which is the present storyline. because it's a lovely time to write in, because there was no internet and people didn't have mobile phones, which is much more convenient for a fiction writer, let me tell you. All right. 1992. It started with a letter that had been lost a long time, waiting out half a century in a forgotten postal bag in the dim attic of a nondescript house in Bermondsey. I think about it sometimes, that mailbag, of the hundreds of love letters, grocery bills, birthday cards, notes from children to their parents that lay together, swelling and sighing as their thwarted messages whispered in the dark, waiting for someone to realize they were there. For it is said, you know, that a letter will always seek a reader, that sooner or later, like it or not, words have a way of finding the light, of making their secrets known. Forgive me, I'm being romantic, a habit acquired from the years spent reading 19th century novels with a torch when my parents thought I was asleep. What I mean to say is that it's odd to think that if Arthur Tyrrell had been a little more responsible, if he hadn't had one too many rum toddies that Christmas Eve in 1941 and gone home and fallen into a drunken slumber instead of finishing his mail delivery, if the bag hadn't then been tucked in his attic and hidden until his death some 50 years later, when one of his daughters unearthed it and called the Daily Mail, the whole thing might have turned out differently. For my mum, for me, and especially for Juniper Blythe. You probably read about it when it happened. It was in all the newspapers and on the TV news. Channel 4 even ran a special where they invited some of the recipients to talk about their letter, their particular voice from the past that had come back to surprise them. There was the woman whose sweetheart had been in the RAF, and the man with the birthday card his evacuated son had sent, the little boy who was killed by a piece of shrapnel a week or so later. It was a very good program, I thought, moving in parts, happy and sad stories interspersed with old footage of the war. I cried a couple of times, but that's not saying much. I'm rather disposed to weeping. Mum didn't go on the show, though. The producers contacted her and asked whether there was anything special in her letter that she'd like to share with the nation, but she said no, that it was just an ordinary old clothing order from a shop that had long ago gone out of business. But that wasn't the truth. I know this because I was there when the letter arrived. I saw her reaction to that lost letter, and it was anything but ordinary. It was a morning in late February. Winter still had us by the throat, the flower beds were icy, and I'd come over to help with the Sunday roast. I do that sometimes because my parents like it, even though I'm a vegetarian, and I know that at some point during the course of the meal, my mother will start to look worried, then agonized, until finally she can stand it no longer and statistics about protein and anemia will begin to fly. I was peeling potatoes into the sink when the letter dropped through the slot in the door. The mail doesn't usually come on Sunday, so that should have tipped us off, but it didn't. "Edie, can you get that?" This was my mother. Edie is me. I'm sorry, I should have said so earlier. She nodded towards the hallway and gestured with the hand that wasn't stuck up the inside of the chicken. I put down the potato, wiped my hands on a tea towel, and went to fetch the post. There was only one letter lying on the welcome mat, an official post office envelope declaring the contents to be redirected mail. I read the label to Mum as I brought it into the kitchen. She'd finished stuffing the chicken by then and was drying her own hands. Frowning a little, from habit rather than any particular expectation, she took the letter from me and plucked her reading glasses from the pineapple in the fruit bowl. She skimmed the post office notice and with a flicker of her eyebrows began to open the outer envelope. I'd turned back to the potatoes by now, a task that was arguably more engaging than watching my mum open mail, so I'm sorry to say I didn't see her face as she fished the smaller envelope from inside, as she registered the frail austerity paper and the old stamp, as she turned the letter over and read the name written on the back. I've imagined it many times since, though, the colour draining instantly from her cheeks, her fingers beginning to tremble so that it took minutes before she was able to slit the envelope open. What I don't have to imagine is the sound, the horrid guttural gasp followed quickly by a series of rasping sobs that swamped the air and made me slip with the peeler so that I cut my finger. "Mum?" I went to her, draping my arm around her shoulders, careful not to bleed on her dress. But she didn't say anything. She couldn't, she later told me. Not then. She stood rigidly as tears spilled down her cheeks, and she clutched that strange little envelope, its paper so thin I could make out the corner of the folded letter inside. Then she disappeared upstairs, into her bedroom, leaving a fraying wake of instructions about the bird and the oven and the potatoes. The kitchen settled in a bruised silence around her absence, and I stayed very quiet, moved very slowly so as not to disturb it further. My mother is not a crier, but this moment, her upset and the shock of it felt oddly familiar, as if we'd been here before. After 15 minutes, in which I variously peeled potatoes, turned over possibilities as to whom the letter might be from, and wondered how to proceed, I finally knocked on her door and asked whether she'd like a cup of tea. She'd composed herself by then, and we sat opposite one another at the small formica-covered table in the kitchen. As I pretended not to notice she'd been crying, she began to talk about the envelope's contents.
Now, I think every author needs a good war story, and thankfully, in many ways, that you've had 2 manuscripts rejected, because, you know, you have to be like J.K. Rowling. She had 14 rejections.
Well, it's just unlikable to have your first book picked up.
But what I'd like to know, what is it like to be a truly successful author, and did your success change you or your lifestyle?
Well, it's great to have your books being read. I think that's what all authors want. I mean, otherwise, the publishing, you know, part of that is the public nature of it, putting something out there. And for me, it's about that. I love writing, but my books really come alive and start to breathe when other people pick them up and turn to the first page, and the world of the story comes to life for them. That feels great. So I do love that. As to how life has changed, I suppose it has, in that my writing used to be something I did around the edges and really just fit in around, you know, working in all-you-can-eat seafood restaurants and selling jewellery and serving hors d'oeuvres at weddings and, you know, whatever else I did to actually make money to survive. Whereas now it's something I can do. I can treat it like my priority in terms, you know, in work terms. But, you know, I have 2 little boys, so, you know, it is a juggling act, and it's not something where, oh, you know, I get up first thing in the morning and I don't talk to anyone and I just head straight for the computer because I want, you know, my characters' voices to be the first thing I hear. No. I spend a lot of the morning saying, put your shoes on. Could you put your shoes on, darling? Put your shoes on. Put your shoes on! Just like any other parent. And, you know, I can be in the middle of writing a really moving scene when, you know, my son, it will be school pickup time, and I'll pick him up, and, you know, in his bag there'll be a notice telling me the whole class has head lice, so it's time to, you know, so it's a very, very normal existence when you have small children.
Keep you down to earth.
Oh yes, and my son Louis, you know, I got the English edition of The Distant Hours, and I loved the end papers. They'd actually had the letter made, you know, with proper old stamp and old-fashioned handwriting. So beautiful. And I got my first copy, and oh, wonderful, left it in my office and turned my back for about, seriously, 8 seconds. And when I turned back, Louis, my 2-year-old, was standing in there with a red texter. And he'd really collaborated well. It was, you know, a great effort. He does a beautiful circle for a 2-year-old, all over the end papers.
So when do you get to write? Where do you?
Well, I'm lucky now. Oliver has started school, and we are so fortunate because we have grandparents in Brisbane who love to, you know, have Louis visit them, which is great for all of us. So I do have more designated writing time now. But, you know, I work after I've put the kids to bed. You know, 7 p.m. is a great time. It can feel like the last thing. You know, at 5 p.m. I've got a lot of energy, but somehow the 2 hours between 5 and 7 really have a way of, you know, sapping that energy. But I write whenever I can.
And your partner, works from home as well, so
does.
You don't drive each other crazy. You sort of work it out. You've got your own personal space.
We do. Davin writes music for documentaries and film and TV. So he's got his studio and I have my office. And we sort of meet up in the kitchen and talk about what we watched on TV that night. Oh, I watched this. Yeah, me too. Isn't that funny? You know, given we were in the same room. But we do make it work. And he is just, you know, such a brilliant husband for a writer to have. For one thing, he does as many school drop-offs and pickups as I do. He's great with the little people. And he understands a creative job. The only time it doesn't work is when we're both on a deadline, and then we get very possessive of our time. I need time, but I need time. No, I need time.
And reading, do you get much time for your own reading that's not research?
That's a really tricky question because, you know, I became a writer because I love reading, but once you become a writer, there's less time for reading and you read differently. I find it's very hard to turn off the writer in my head, so that, you know, I'll pick up a book and start reading and I get waylaid with thoughts about the structure and, oh, I wonder what the writer's doing here, and oh, that's tricky, oh, very nice, you know, and I go, what's it about? Better flip back. And so sliding down the rabbit hole doesn't happen as easily as it used to. And I'm always behind with reading. You know, I've just started this great book you might have heard of. It's called The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. So yeah, I'm way out of date with reading.